Moses, once a prince of Egypt, returned from exile. He carried a message from God. He stood before Pharaoh, a ruler who claimed to be a god himself. "Let my people go," Moses declared, his voice echoing in the grand hall. The Israelites, enslaved for generations, looked to Moses with a glimmer of hope. Pharaoh, surrounded by luxury and power, scoffed at the demand. He refused. The God of the Israelites, he claimed, was nothing compared to his own might. Pharaoh's heart hardened. He would not release the Israelites from their bonds. He would not acknowledge a power greater than his own. He would learn, through suffering and devastation, the price of defying the true God. The plagues were coming. One by one they would descend upon Egypt, each a testament to the power of God, each a warning to Pharaoh and his people. The Nile, lifeblood of Egypt, turned to blood. Fish died, the water stank, and a crimson tide flowed through the land. The Egyptians, their lives entwined with the river, recoiled in horror. Their gods, they believed, had been defeated. Pharaoh, however, remained unmoved. His magicians, he claimed, could replicate this feat. He dismissed Moses' pleas, his heart unyielding. The Nile, once a source of life, now brought only fear and disgust. The stench of death hung heavy in the air. The people cried out in despair, but Pharaoh remained steadfast in his defiance. He would not be swayed by this display of power. He believed himself to be above such things, protected by his own authority and the might of his gods. His pride, however, would be his undoing. The waters receded, but a new horror emerged. Frogs, in numbers beyond counting, swarmed the land. They filled the homes, the streets, even Pharaoh's palace. Their croaking filled the air, a constant reminder of the plague. The Egyptians, already reeling from the bloody Nile, were driven to distraction by the relentless amphibians. Still, Pharaoh held firm. His magicians, he insisted, could also summon frogs. He clung to his pride, even as the frogs hopped through his palace chambers. The air grew thick with the smell of frogs. They were everywhere, a living, croaking carpet that covered the land. Sleep became impossible, every surface crawling with the slimy creatures. The Egyptians, their patience exhausted, pleaded with Pharaoh to relent, but he refused. He would not be broken by this infestation, no matter how unbearable it became. The frogs vanished, leaving behind a stench that lingered. But relief was short-lived. Tiny, biting lice appeared, infesting every person and animal in Egypt. The Egyptians scratched and clawed at their skin, driven mad by the relentless itching. Pharaoh's magicians, their powers failing, declared this to be the finger of God. Yet Pharaoh remained unmoved. His pride had become a prison, his heart hardened against compassion and reason. Even in the privacy of his chambers, Pharaoh could find no escape from the biting lice. They crawled in his robes, his hair, even his food. The constant irritation gnawed at his composure, but still he clung to his defiance. He would not be humiliated, not even by this plague of tiny tormentors. The beasts of the field, flies of the air, the lice vanished, but the respite was brief. Swarms of wild beasts, driven by an unseen force, descended upon Egypt. Lions, wolves, and other predators stalked the land, while stinging flies filled the air, a buzzing, biting torment. The Egyptians, their livestock attacked, their crops trampled, cowered in fear. This plague, unlike the others, targeted their livelihood, their very survival. Yet Pharaoh, blinded by pride, still refused to release the Israelites. The air buzzed with the sound of flies, their bites a constant irritation. The stench of animal dung and fear filled the streets. The Egyptians, their way of life unraveling, pleaded with Pharaoh for relief, but his heart had become like stone. He would not be swayed, not even by the threat of famine and chaos. The death of the livestock. A pestilence swept through Egypt, striking down the livestock. Horses, cattle, sheep, all perished, their bodies rotting in the fields. The Egyptians, their source of food and livelihood decimated, were plunged into despair. The stench of death hung heavy in the air. Still, Pharaoh, his heart hardened against the suffering of his people, refused to yield. He clung to his power, even as his kingdom crumbled around him. The loss of the livestock was a devastating blow. It represented not just a loss of wealth, but a threat to their very survival. Without animals to work the fields or provide sustenance, the Egyptians faced starvation. Still, Pharaoh remained resolute. He would not be broken, not even by the cries of his people. The boils of Egypt. Painful, festering boils erupted on the skin of the Egyptians. From the lowliest peasant to the highest noble, none were spared. The air filled with the groans of the afflicted. Pharaoh himself, his body covered in boils, finally experienced the wrath of God firsthand. Yet, even as he suffered, his pride held him captive. He refused to let the Israelites go. The pain was relentless, a burning itch that could not be soothed. The Egyptians, covered in weeping sores, cried out for mercy. Their gods, it seemed, offered no protection from this agonizing affliction. Even Pharaoh, accustomed to luxury and ease, suffered alongside his people. But his spirit remained unbroken. He would endure, he believed, and emerge victorious. Fury from the skies. The sky turned black as a terrifying hailstorm descended upon Egypt. Hailstones, some as large as fists, rained down with devastating force, destroying crops, shattering buildings, and killing indiscriminately. The Egyptians, caught in the open, were battered and bruised, their cries swallowed by the roar of the storm. This was a display of power unlike any they had witnessed before. Still, Pharaoh, his heart hardened against fear, refused to relent. The storm raged for hours, a relentless assault on the land. When it finally subsided, Egypt was left in ruins. Fields were destroyed, homes were shattered, and the bodies of men and animals lay scattered amidst the debris. The Egyptians, their faces etched with fear and despair, looked to Pharaoh for guidance, but he had none to offer. A plague of locusts. A vast swarm of locusts descended upon Egypt, blotting out the sun. They devoured everything in their path, stripping fields bare, leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. The Egyptians, already reeling from the hail, now faced starvation. Their pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears. Pharaoh, his resolve unwavering, clung to his pride, even as his kingdom crumbled around him. The air buzzed with the sound of millions of wings. The locusts, relentless and insatiable, stripped the land bare in a matter of hours. Fields that had survived the hail were now barren wastelands. The Egyptians, their hopes dwindling with each passing moment, knew that true famine was upon them. Darkness descends. A thick, palpable darkness enveloped Egypt, a darkness that could be felt. For 3 days and 3 nights the Egyptians lived in utter blackness, their fear amplified by the unseen. They could not see their hand in front of their faces, and the silence was broken only by their own terrified whispers. This was a darkness that chilled them to the bone, a darkness that seemed to symbolize the state of Pharaoh's heart. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that smothered all light and hope. The Egyptians, trapped in their homes, were consumed by fear and uncertainty. They stumbled through the streets, their voices echoing in the unnatural silence. Even within the confines of his palace, Pharaoh felt the oppressive weight of the darkness. Death of the firstborn, the final plague, the most devastating, struck at the heart of every Egyptian family. At midnight, a cry of anguish swept through the land as the firstborn sons of Egypt, from the poorest family to the Pharaoh's son himself, died in their sleep. The silence of the previous nights was shattered by the wails of grieving parents. This was the price of Pharaoh's stubbornness, a price paid in the blood of innocence. The cries of grief echoed through the streets, a chilling symphony of despair. The Egyptians, their hearts finally broken, turned on Pharaoh, demanding that he let the Israelites go. Their own gods had failed them. Their own ruler had brought this tragedy upon them. Exodus and deliverance. Broken at last, Pharaoh relented. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the dead of night. "Leave," he croaked, his voice hoarse with grief. The Israelites, their belongings packed, wasted no time. They streamed out of Egypt, a vast exodus under the watchful eye of Moses. Their journey to freedom had begun. Pharaoh, his grief turning to anger, had a change of heart. He sent his chariots thundering after the fleeing Israelites, determined to bring them back. But God intervened. As the Israelites reached the Red Sea, the waters parted, creating a dry path. They crossed on dry ground, the waters a wall to their left and right. The pursuing Egyptian army, blinded by rage, charged into the seabed. But the waters, at Moses' command, crashed down, swallowing Pharaoh's army whole. The Israelites, safe on the far shore, witnessed the awesome power of their God. They were free. Their long nightmare was over, and they would never forget the day their God parted the sea and delivered them from slavery.